With that said, I'm going to hand this conversation over to our guest moderator for tonight, Mr. Will Snowden. Thank you, Will, for being here tonight. I'm going to hand it over to you. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here with you all. And as part of an introduction or an introductory question, I'm going to ask our guest to share with us one of their favorite memories from childhood. You know, we're reflecting on the anniversary of civil rights, the progress we've been able to make over the years. And sometimes we don't get to reflect on the joys of our childhood. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to start with Ms. Tate, and then we'll go to Chancellor Pierre, and then Judge Johnson. Ms. Tate, could you share with us one of your favorite memories from childhood?
Oh, my goodness. I think one of my favorites was the Delta sorority gave us a Christmas party the year that we desegregated McDonald 19. And I remember receiving so many toys that we just had to give some away. It was just too much for just one child. And I kind of remember, you know, I can remember everything about that day, but I don't know if I was happy. I was excited because I was going to a new school, but I was a little bit curious. I was just a little bit wondering what's really going on. But I think I was happy when we were all together for that Christmas function. Yeah.
So much. Chancellor Pierre, favorite memory from childhood?
Actually, it goes back to the actual being able to see the March on Washington, which was televised in late August 1963. I really watched with amazement as to what I was seeing. I didn't know if I truly understood all of it at the time, but it was truly an amazing event to watch. And seeing Dr. Martin Luther King speak that day, it really caught my attention in a way that really helped me understand. And I was a very young child, but when all of that was happening, it was truly an amazing event. And I just remember how that was televised and how just transformational the experience was.
Thank you very much. Judge Johnson, what's one of your favorite memories from childhood?
Well, I thank God I have a lot of great memories from childhood. This I'll share though, being 10, 11, growing up in a small town, Plaquemine, and playing with my friends. And we played all over my little town. On our bicycles, our roller skates, we literally played all over it. And it was bordered by the Mississippi River and the levee. And there was concrete embankments going to go up the levee. So we could both ride our bikes and our roller skates, and we can go up and down on that concrete. And I was, 10, 11, and that was a great memory for me. But growing up in the country, y'all, and being in that kind of kid before all hell broke loose. But it was great memories for me.
Thank you so much. Speaking of hell breaking loose, can you know, there were different reactions to the Civil Rights Act being passed in 1964. There was celebration, and then there was also people who were kind of frustrated by it. Judge Johnson, I'm going to stick with you. Can you share with us, if you remember, where you were when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed?
That's interesting as you frame it like that. I just got out of a court case where attorney Lolis Eli was my lawyer and was representing me on being charged with inciting a riot. This is the spring of 1964. Being charged with inciting a riot. And so the civil rights passage, the bill passage, it was good, but I was kind of pissed off in that time frame. So I didn't necessarily have a great appreciation of that because I was not necessarily a happy camper.
Understood. Thank you for that. Chancellor Pierre, do you remember where you were when the Civil Rights Act passed?
Well, that was in summer of 1964, and I was just having fun as a child, not truly understanding the true significance of what was happening, except that I knew things were changing. And you could sense that as a child that things were changing, because obviously one of the big things was the ability to go into the supermarkets in a small parish, Iberia Parish, and to the retail stores like the Abdallahs and the Wormses, and being treated a little differently. I do remember that, and obviously, again, the true sense of it I could not really appreciate, but it was very, very important to begin to start imagining what my life would be like in a different world.
Thanks for that. Miss Tate, how about you? Do you remember where you were when the Civil Rights Act passed?
I think she's muted.
Miss Tate, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. That was third grade for me. I don't know, we was put in an environment at that time where everybody was hostile to us. And I think at that time, during that time, was when we really start recognizing that it was because of the color of our skin. So I'm sure all of that was going on during that time, and that probably sparked their actions. You know, it was just horrific. I don't wish those days on anybody's child. Yeah.
I'm reminded that you, Miss Tate, you, Chancellor Pierre, and you, Judge Johnson, have all been firsts of some variety. First to do, be in the courtroom for arguing a particular case, the first to be in a classroom for learning, many different firsts. It's often an experience of being Black in America, and being sometimes in a marginalized community, of being the first to do something, and recognizing that the first Black person to do something is not actually Black progress, that's white progress. Or the first woman to do something is not woman progress, it's male progress. And the idea that there have been restrictions put in place, keeping people out of certain areas. Ms. Tate, I'm gonna start with you. From your perspective, what was your appreciation of what the Civil Rights Act was supposed to do?
Let me make sure I'm not on mute. Okay, I'm not muted. It allowed me to go to a school that was a little bit more advanced than where I had been. I'm not sure if all of their actions was that they provided was supposed to be provided, or we should have gotten more, but our first grade year was excellent. After that, we were on our own. We had to do our best to proceed, but I'm thinking it was just, I don't know. That's all I can remember, really.
Okay. Judge Johnson, from your perspective, what was the Civil Rights Act supposed to do?
The thought around it was, of course, that it would change how we lived in so many aspects of life. But we had those thoughts that it would change, and it would be such that those things that we found impediments to living joyously and freely, the Civil Rights Act itself would change. Well, that never happened. And so to this day, it really never happened, because the reality is you can't legislate how people actually think or feel. And so it never really truly happened in the way, or in the sense, I think, of how, again, in 1964, I had just made 17 years old. And so how at that time, at that point in time, how you thought about it, and I'm saying at that point in time, how I thought about it, that I thought that it would be miraculous, that it would be such thing that life would fundamentally change. Well, life did not fundamentally change, but that was how I thought about it.
Quick follow-up. You said you can't legislate how people think or feel. Do you think legislation still has value in terms of where our country might be able to head in terms of the values that we have as the United States?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Law is as an important a thing today as it ever was in terms of shaping how life actually is. So law is very important for that. But I was at a book signing by this young guy whose last name is, I think, Barrett. I think that's his name. But one of the things he constantly talked about was in reality, when you look at America, is there really law? And so he makes the argument that we have things in writing as regards what we believe or how we act or what we do, but then we have practice. And so it's debatable to law is from that perspective is debatable, but law is absolutely important in terms of how we shape life.
Thank you for that. Chancellor Pierre, from your perspective, what do you think the Civil Rights Act was supposed to do?
Well, the Civil Rights Act, in my mind, was supposed to give people opportunities to access public accommodations on an equal basis, and that just because they were Black, they were not subjugated to second-class citizenship. Now, the practical implementation is a little bit different. I could remember how my older siblings and my mom and dad talked about things, how things could be different, would be different. I was going to be the biggest recipient of that change because I was just such a youngster when all of this happened. But there was also a reality that all things were not changed. There were still places, for example, even after the 664 Civil Rights Act, that would not let African Americans walk through the front door. If you wanted to be served, you had to be served in the side door. And I think what happened was that from my parents' perspective, what they taught me was you don't have to be treated that way. So we're not going to patronize those places that are not going to treat us with a sense of equal dignity. So it was that sense that really made a big difference in terms of my own experiences in life, because even then, there still were segregated schools. So you had to deal with that. But you could see little differences in terms of access to the movie theaters, how you were treated maybe in a department store. And so it was those kinds of things that really sort of formed my vision of what things could be like in a place where your color did not preclude you from accessing opportunity.
Chancellor Pierre, can you talk a little bit more about, as a young person, recognizing the act of not spending your money somewhere where you weren't necessarily wanted or weren't necessarily treated equally, and the role that those kind of demonstrations or those kind of that civil disobedience or those acts of resistance, what role did those types of actions from the people experiencing those injustices play in changing people's perspective of what equality could look like?
Well, one of the things that really I think became important was understanding that we had value. And if we gave away our value by being subjected to a prior regime, then we lost something. So it was very, very important, and they were very, very poignant in pointing out the places where Blacks were not treated fair, and therefore you will not go to those places. And so it was a recognition that we had the power to select where we could go, how we could use whatever economic tools we had to be treated as individuals of value, and how we approach people. Now, there were some folks who still were part of that old mindset of, for example, not looking eye to eye white people, just going and not understanding their own sense of economic independence. So it was really a much easier task for me, and probably because I grew up on a farm where my mother and father, you know, they weren't sharecroppers. They actually owned the land. My grandfather owned the land. We just dealt with it differently. We recognized that the Civil Rights Act gave us a sense of empowerment and just handed back by the way we behave.
Thank you for that. Ms. Tate, you commented a little earlier about being brought into places that in environments that were where you weren't necessarily wanted, and where people like you were treated you know, were treated with disrespect, and were treated as just not belonging. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how those environments play a role on a young person's psyche in terms of how they view themselves and how they view their community.
Well, our first year, you know, when we entered, it was a full body of students at the school. But once we got placed in the classroom, all the parents pulled their students out. So that left the three of us in that building for a year and a half alone. So we didn't really experience any of that until third grade. We were transferred to Sims School because McDonough 19 had been it was a black school from then on, because none of hardly any of the whites came back. So the thing was to keep us in a white school. At Sims, it was horrific. That's the only way I can describe it. The teachers coerced students to do things toward us. We had to endure a lot in order for it to work. And the way they progressed integration was just baffling. And if we would have failed, it would have or not participated with it, it wouldn't have happened. Because it progressed as we progressed to grade. But you know, we had to shelter ourselves at that school. We didn't have the marshals anymore, or the New Orleans Police Department, and it just was a lot. But we had to stay on top of things that we needed to take our schoolwork, for instance. We just had to stay on top of that, you know. And thank God we had support and family members to keep us encouraged to keep on doing this and keep our parents strong. Well, my mom was pretty steadfast. She was going to make it work anyway. But it just was a different environment for any child. I wouldn't put a child in that setting. That was not without, like the marshal said, why wouldn't we actually come back? Not without the marshal. I wouldn't do that.
Thank you for sharing that. Ms. Tate, I'm not from New Orleans. I got here as quickly as I could. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I have heard about this thing called McDonough Day. Are you able to share what that was for those of us who may not be familiar with it?
It was a holiday. Well, not really a holiday because we went to school that day, but I can remember the John McDonough statue by City Hall. And I got to attend one of those field trips, and they brought flowers and they brought a whole lot of stuff, you know, not realizing who John McDonough really was at that time. You know, it was like a sacrifice to well, not a sacrifice, something spiritual for this person. You know, to me, you know, I noticed that it was predominantly white. There was only a few of us, and I kind of was a little uncomfortable when I first was allowed to go on this field trip. And the first person I laid eyes on that really made me feel comfortable was Mr. Baptiste at that time. He worked at City Hall. And I don't know, it was just horrific. But they gave out keys to the city, certain children that had a high enough average, which didn't work for the black kids, whether they had the high enough average or not. And McDonough Day just was I don't know even why it was a disgrace to me. The more I think about it, it was really a disgrace. you was asked to wear white. Well, this next time I went, I didn't wear white. My mom didn't put white on me. I did get to go, but I didn't wear white.
Thanks for that. And what I've learned a little bit over the years, is that McDonough, made a lot of his wealth off of enslaved people and also in real estate. And part of his, I don't know if it was a trust that he created, but the wealth, the way that he passed along his wealth in supporting public schools, one of the requirements or the conditions of that funding was that students had to come and bring either carnations or roses or something along those lines to these statues to
Right.
praise him, which kind of makes you question what was his true intention of trying to support education. My wife is from New Orleans. She went to McDonough 35. Her mom went to McDonough 35, and my mother-in-law has shared a story about the Black students having to wait on the bus and their flowers basically wilting and dying because all the white students had to go first. And just thinking about, even though there were efforts to kind of integrate schools, or the remnants of segregation were certainly still there. Speaking of integration, some people have said, and I'm coming to you, Judge Johnson, some people have said that the quality of education was actually better when we had segregated schools, and that integration actually reduced educational opportunities. Wondering if you could share your perspective on that, Judge Johnson, with this idea that integration actually did more harm than good when it came to the quality of education that Black people were receiving in America.
Interestingly, this is a debate. I mentioned my lawyer, Lolis Eli, but he became my best friend. But it's a debate that we had over the course of his life, from the time I met him till the time he passed. But the debate would be, we would argue the benefit or not of integration generally. But then we would also talk about, of course, the difference in predominantly, the colored schools. I finished high school from a colored high school. I have a diploma from my high school. I have my high school diploma. I framed it, and it shows that I finished from a colored high school, and it was signed by the superintendent of colored schools, who of course was white, but who it was signed by. That high school no longer exists. That high school went out of existence in 1969, when it was, like so many other high schools in Louisiana, Black high schools, were integrated out of existence. And the way those schools operated, there were people there, the teachers there were this is now coming out in a lot of literature as regards that time frame. But a lot of the teachers who operated in those schools were better educated than the equivalent white teacher in similar public schools in the South. That these Black people were better educated. In my high school, we had the physics teacher was a reserved major out of the Army who had served in the Korean War, who flew his own airplane, and he had finished in physics from Xavier, and he had a master's in physics from Xavier. He was the physics teacher. We had a history teacher who was similarly structured in terms of academics, similarly structured. And what I'm talking about, though, played out across a lot of these high schools, Black high schools in Louisiana. If you go to Booker T. Washington High School, for instance, and if you look at it in the 40s and the 50s, that high school had an incredible wealth of both academic talent, but it also had the cultural piece that was the heart of New Orleans. That high school had its own newspaper. It had all kinds of stuff, so that you could make an argument that those high schools were producing people equivalent to any other high schools. Of course, I mean in all the white high schools. Again, going back to my high school, we had doctors, and we got lawyers, we got a general, we got a vice president of an international paper company, a chair of a nonprofit, a New York nonprofit, all from my high school. So yes, there's an argument you could make that those schools, that people who finished from those high schools in those years were very well educated. And that's in spite of the fact that they didn't necessarily have the same kind of resources. That is they didn't have the current book, that the others might have had, but they had a wealth in terms of talented people who were there teaching. I want to say one more thing, and not on this subject, because I don't want to forget. At this stage of life, I forget half the things I want to say.
Go
We have
ahead.
to put in the 60s in context. We have to always remember Vietnam for black men was hanging over our head an axe. So when we talk about the middle 60s to an eight, now I'm 18 years old in 65, and I'm registering for the draft. Well, that's my context. Is I don't want to die in Vietnam. But anyway, with that, I'll shut up.
Thank you for sharing that. Chancellor Pierre, you lead Southern University Law Center, and want to hear your perspective from a kind of graduate school perspective on the value, or not the value, but what role, if any, did integration play in either improving or maybe not improving the quality of education, but also talk to us about the value of having an institution like Southern University Law Center to produce Black lawyers who historically, at the time of its creation, were kept out from accessing that type of a degree.
Well, thank you for that question. So when you think about the whole issue about the Civil Rights Act and then integration, so really they were on two separate paths. So when we talk about the concept of integration, you really have to go back to 1954 to Brown v. Board, and then Brown 2 in 55. So the Civil Rights Act is part of the march that comes out from all those years of protests and sit-ins and various civil disobedience that ultimately acts in 1964. And what happens is that historically Black law schools are playing a very, very important part of creating the individuals that are litigating the most important cases at that time to dismantle the whole idea of separate but equal and Plessy and this whole idea of not accessing rights prior to the 1964 Act. So when you look at the history of Southern University Law Center, for example, it starts really in 1947 after Mr. Hatfield, Charles Hatfield, challenges LSU to admit him into law school, he being a graduate of Xavier University. And when it really looked like there was a chance that LSU would have to admit him based upon the work that Thurgood Marshall was doing across the country, they hurriedly put together a separate law school at Southern University without any of the real resources needed to be successful. What they couldn't imagine was the commitment of the people who would educate Black lawyers, who would then go out and be involved in the most important civil rights cases in the state of Louisiana from that standpoint, whether you're talking about Jesse Stone and the work he did in Shreveport and others in the late 50s and early 60s, the school desegregation cases that came about, all of those were very, very important times. And what happened was we had the ability to create lawyers who were going to be social activists, who were going to be change agents in their communities. And I think that's probably the most important part. What happened, of course, over the years is as the size of those law schools grew, when other opportunities were presented, for example, to challenge how judges were elected with respect to the application of the Voting Rights Act, which came 1 year after the Civil Rights Act, it was Southern University Law School alums that were leading the charge to open those doors in the mid-70s and to continuously do that, so much so that most people don't recognize today that Louisiana has the greatest number of African-American judges per capita in the US. and that number keeps growing and the opportunities keep growing. So you look at that particular aspect of it and the whole role of HBCU as part of this whole Civil Rights Act, because it was students from HBCUs that were involved in a lot of the protests that led to the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Most people don't recognize that the planning for Mississippi Freedom Summer, which is sort of the important catalyst to the Civil Rights Act because of what happened in Mississippi in 1964, was started at Tougaloo College. So the impact of historically Black colleges and universities was extremely significant. And even after integration and the Civil Rights Act, the most enduring legacy is the impact of HBCUs, even to this day, when we look at all the efforts to eliminate DEI in majority institutions and to eliminate at the K through 12 level the whole idea that Black history should not be taught in the way that it should be taught. So all those things are important, and the role of HBCUs cannot be understated in all of that.
Thanks for that, Chancellor Pierre. And I have a quick follow-up question. This year, we have seen legislation passed in the Louisiana Capitol during a special crime session that I know, and I've reviewed some studies that are predicting to increase our prison population by more than double in 6 years, essentially. And it really rolled back a lot of reforms that were advanced in 2017 under something called the Justice Reinvestment bills. And I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit about what you commented about. A lot of the lawyers who were litigating Brown versus Board of Education, Brown versus Board 2, these were lawyers who were products of HBCUs. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with the audience some of the things that Southern University Law Center is doing to help kind of grow those types of civil rights lawyers to bring future fights that we know are going to be on our doorstep.
Well, I'm very proud to tell you that we have been very intricately involved in that. We have some great scholars who are leading in this charge. For example, Professor Angela Allen Bell is a great scholar and leader and social activist. And she led the movement to eliminate non-unanimous juries in the state of Louisiana. There are people who are in prison who were convicted without a unanimous jury. And so she led that very important fight to eliminate that, because the only two states left with non-unanimous juries at the time was Louisiana and Oregon. And the reason non-unanimous juries came to be is because of the Constitutional Convention in the 1890s, where they wanted to make sure that they didn't need to have a unanimous jury, because Blacks might get on those juries to convict African-American men, particularly. The other aspect is we've been involved in a number of years with the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, led by a professor out of Northeastern in collaboration with Southern University Law Center. Professor Burnham is a great lawyer. I mean, she was part of Freedom Summer 1964 as a teenager, and she represented Angela Davis in her famous case. And she's been working with our students. Miss Ada Lampkin Goodley Lampkin has been working with her a number of years so that we can help deal with restorative justice issues and prepare our students to understand how to make those arguments that are necessary. And the other part, which I think is extremely important, is that we, just as we talk about folks on the defense side, we have to curate and create more African Americans who can become district attorneys, who can then make decisions that will help figure out how do we provide justice to people. You know, obviously we have people who commit bad crimes, and rightly they should be in prison, but there are a lot of folks who don't. And we want to eliminate the idea that Louisiana had the highest incarceration rate in the world by virtue of the fact that the United States has the highest incarceration rate of any industrialized country, and Louisiana had the highest incarceration rate inside the United States. That meant that we were had the highest incarceration rate in the whole world. So it's those kinds of actions to deal with those issues, and we have a number of different alums that are still doing work to challenge how voting is being eviscerated, how we access opportunities in terms of educational equity. All those things are still on the table because we see a backlash in America to try to turn back the clock so that it has detrimental impacts on African Americans.
I'm going to add a footnote to your commentary as it relates to Louisiana's highest incarceration rate, to remind folks that if incarceration provided us with public safety, we'd be the safest state in the country. And we really need to revisit our understanding of the role that incarceration is supposed to play, because as Chancellor Pierre has indicated, we've had the highest incarceration rate for decades, and it has not provided us with public safety. So when we're having conversations about promoting public safety, we can't continue to use the old tool of incarceration to expect our communities to be able to thrive, and be open to conversations about investments that can be made in our communities to prevent crime from ever happening in the first place. Ms. Tate, I want to come to you. You opened and created New Orleans' first civil rights museum. Can you share with us a little bit about what prompted you to open up this museum, and what were you seeing that was missing that really stood out to you to say, hey, we have to have this space in our city?
Well, my first intention was just to get the building open up as a school, but they assured me that, or the Orleans Parish School Board assured me that it wouldn't be a school again. So they were undecided what they wanted to do with it, but I know if it was demolished, our history would be gone and it wouldn't be told anywhere else. It took a lot for us to even acquire the building, but I knew that it needed to be something educational. It's not a museum, it's an interpretive center because we don't archive, so we can't call it a museum. But it's there to educate those on the civil rights movement, and not just the desegregation of public school. We wanna extend it to what all the civil rights movement that happened in New Orleans. And right now we've passed the development stage of the building. We're trying to get exhibits created for those, but to tell those stories. But I knew that it had to be, it had to tell the story of what happened there, and I think that's really what sold the you know, all of our funders. We had 16 different funders. It was $16.2 million to renovate, but we're there. We're focusing on all types of racial equity. People's Institute share the building with us. Louisiana Museum of African American History share the building with us, and Beloved Community Development share the building. And I think we all are working to do the same thing, and just to help the people that it's in need of the help. But it's so hard to pull in people that right here in our own community. It's really hard to get them to come in. But we're welcoming those that protested in those days to come in and let's talk about it. I think we'll have that dialogue at the TEP Center. We need to talk about these things, and maybe some of this stuff will overcome. The students are coming, because if I go to the schools, they don't know anything about what happened back then. They think that happened during slavery. But if they come in and they see the visual aids, and then if I come out and they see me, they understand it a little bit better. And I'm hoping that helps them to appreciate school a little bit better. And we also have housing for the 55 or older. We have 25 affordable units on the second and third level.
Will,
You answered my
Will?
yeah, Betty.
I'm sorry, this is Betty. Justice Johnson just got on the call. I think
Okay,
she's
great.
muted, but she's on the call. Justice
Thank you so
Johnson, can
much.
you unmute?
Can you hear me?
Hi,
Can you
Justice
hear me?
Johnson. Yes, we can hear you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so
Good
much.
evening. How's everyone on the call?
We're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I know civil rights is so important right now, and I'm glad that I was able to join and hear some of Dr. Leona Tate's presentation. We of course are still grieving Tessie Prevost's passing, and we still are so appreciative of what those three young women did in desegregating McDonough 19 Elementary School. And of course, we do remember Ruby Bridges and her sacrifices as well. And you know, this is that time when we when we're talking about the civil rights struggle, we're talking about a time for martyrs, when we had children on the front lines desegregating schools. These I'm from that generation where we looking at children who was, you know, giving their lives for the struggle in so many ways. And so it's just wonderful to see the TEP Center visualize and just a wonderful part of this community. But I know you wanted me to talk about justice and how civil rights has impacted my career, and certainly I wanted to talk some about that, the Civil Rights Act, and how the Civil Rights Act impacted my life. When I was young and growing up in New Orleans, of course, I grew up in a segregated New Orleans. So we rode in the back of the bus, and folks, and I'm sure there have been other folk who've been a part of this conversation who grew up in a segregated New Orleans, riding in the back of the bus. I'm astounded always when I talk with young people. They are not. They just do not know what we're talking about when we're talking about segregated buses, when we're talking about screens on the bus. And they said, "What is that? What are you talking about when you're talking about segregated buses?" Well, I'm talking about a screen on the bus, a piece of wood in the top of a seat where folk are required to move it back so that a white passenger can sit down and black folks have to move to the back of the bus. There's so many folk in New Orleans. They just have never heard of screens. They've never seen a screen. And my good friend Don Hubbard always likes to produce a screen. He has one. And shock folks who have never seen a screen. They don't know what it looks like. So, you know, for those of us who rode on segregated buses, who had to sit in a separate cafeteria, who went to segregated schools, who couldn't go to amusement parks. You know, we went to Lincoln Beach instead of Pontchartrain Beach. So we grew up in a different New Orleans. And so the Civil Rights Act made a difference because it opened up public accommodations for everybody. It meant that we could use restaurants and hotels. We could travel across America. We could buy gas and use the restrooms. We could use hotels, and we could sleep. And we didn't have to leave New Orleans, get all the way to Memphis to get a hotel room if we were on our way to Chicago. So the Civil Rights Act made a difference in America. And of course, we know the Voting Rights Act made a tremendous difference. And so we we are in a struggle now for the same things, because there's so many people in America who are trying to roll back all of these accomplishments. All of the progress we made in terms of voting rights. There are folk in America who are trying to eliminate all of those accomplishments and roll of all of that back. And so we have to educate young people so they understand about democracy, they understand about voting rights, and keep them engaged and involved. And so I just wanted to, just say that generally, and there may be some questions about what folks want to ask me about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Justice Johnson. I'm going to come back to you in a second. Dr. Tate, I had a quick follow-up question. In a time of America where so much of American history is deemed controversial to be taught in schools, particularly Black, African-American history in our country, you talked about the value of preserving the stories that you have experienced in creating the center that you've created. What is your fear, or what was your fear before you created the space? What was your fear of what was going to happen to your story?
That it wouldn't.
My particular story?
I'm sorry, Justice Johnson. This question is for Dr. Tate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because it, the story what happened at McDonogh 19 just wasn't being told, and not the way it should have been told. McDonogh 19 was the first school to integrate, and it was in France. So I just wanted the story to be told the right way, not trying to erase anybody else's history, but to be told the right way. And that's important to me, that everything that we do at the TEP Center is done and told the right way. And I don't know, I was just fearful that if the building was demolished, that then that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have anywhere to do it. But I don't know, it's just, it baffled me that so many people didn't know that story. And I said it's always been there. People don't do their homework. They go by what people tell them. If you would have researched it, the story, it's always been there. But I do fear that it won't be told in schools. But I do want to ask that if they can't be told in schools, why can't the TEP Center be part of that curriculum where they can learn that history?
Thank you, Dr. Tate.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question for everybody before I incorporate at least one of the questions I see in the chat box. And Judge Calvin Johnson, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to come to Chancellor Pierre, and then Justice Johnson, and then back to Dr. Tate. If the next 5 years is a chapter in the civil rights movement, what will it be about?
Wow. The two things that come to my head is, of course, voting and how we will be able to maintain our ability to vote. And that ability, meaning not just simply having the so-called right to vote, but how we can exercise it. Because the forces of evil are trying to, of course, curtail how we exercise our right to vote. And the next 5 years or 4 years or so will probably be just the tipping point, I guess is a good way of putting it, as regards whether we will really maintain how we have real voting and real ability to do so or not. The second thing, though, is history. And for us, Black people, especially in Louisiana, we must maintain our history, and we are losing our history. But Chancellor, I'm really happy that Southern's Library is maintaining a lot of what is really critical to us in terms of our history. And especially I go back to the history of these Black schools that no longer exist. But to be able to have a place where that kind of history of these Black high schools, of also of colleges that once existed in Louisiana, but maintaining our history is critical to us. And if we don't start doing that 5 years from now, because this person will be in his last decades or two, okay, I mean my last couple of decades, but to be people, we can't rely on people like me to talk this talk. We have to get this embedded in the people a lot younger than me, but to see the need and the absolute again need for us to maintain the history of Black people in Louisiana, which is, I suppose, the history of Black people in America. But those two things, voting and history.
Thank you for that, Judge Johnson. And for those who have not had the privilege of practicing in front of Judge Johnson like I have, one of the things I always loved about appearing in front of Judge Johnson is the way that he started court. And it was always with a piece of history, whether it was a piece of history about that building, whether it's a piece of history about New Orleans or Louisiana. Judge Johnson, you have always been a teacher, and for that, I thank you. Chancellor Pierre, same question for you. If the next 5 years is a chapter in the civil rights movement, what will it be about?
Well, it will be about whether or not we can continue our progress to make America a truly multiracial democracy. America has the challenge of now understanding what it means to be a multiracial democracy. And it would be the first multiracial democracy in the history of the world. We really have not seen that. And that is the challenge that we face. That is why you see, even in the presidential campaign and everything else, this open challenge to what would happen if we had a multiracial democracy. You see that happening with respect to challenging the racial identity of Vice President Harris. And the reality is, for our people, that our racial identity is a multiplicity of mixtures. I mean, the reality is, especially in Louisiana, is when you say someone is African American, that could mean a lot. Because the true reality is the Spaniards, the Native Americans, Africans, French, Germans, Italians, even when there were laws, quote, not allowing the mixture happened. And it even goes back to the old world. So the reality is that we have a political dogma that is trying to maintain a purity about America that never existed. And now our challenge is, can we execute through voting and other tools the ability to make America a true multiracial democracy? That is what the next chapter has to be about. If we fail, and we will be set back for many decades. When I watch what's happening now and the arguments people are making in public, it reminds me of I watch a lot on the History Channel and other channels about what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And that is very, very scary to me. So we have to continue to push, and we have to bring young people into this discussion, because I don't think they understood or understand their power in helping America become a multiracial democracy.
Thank you for that, Chancellor Pierre. I'm gonna come to you, Justice Johnson. Same question. If the next 5 years is a chapter in the civil rights movement, what will it be about?
Well, it will certainly be that theme, getting young people to understand their democracy. I'm always amazed that folk who are naturalized citizens understand the value of their democracy, because they have to learn. They have to learn what this democracy is all about. They have to pass a test in order to be an American. And folk who are native-born Americans, they're just born here. They You know, they born here. They don't have to do anything, and as a result, they just take it for granted. I talk with young people. They have no inclination to vote, and so I'm talking with them about why they need to vote. And I have had some people challenge me with what's the point. And so we've got to explain to young people what the point is. The point is that you can't give up your right to vote. You can't sleep on your right to vote. There are too many folk who have lost their lives. You know, we have to remind them about the blood, sweat, and tears, the Medgar Evers, the Emmett Tills. You know, they've heard of the story of Martin Luther King, but we have to remind them about the other folk. You know, the students who stand up to the water hoses and the dogs. You know, these are people who have really put themselves on the line for you, and you need to get out there. All you have to do is go down to City Hall, go to the registrar's office and register to vote. And sometimes the registrar is coming to your school to sign you up at the school. All we want you to do is register to vote. One of the projects that I've been involved in lately is bringing Cohen High School. I graduated from Walter Cohen High School. Bringing Cohen High School students to the Supreme Court and talking with them about government and civics, and we've got to do that piece. We've always encouraged judges to get involved and go back to the classrooms, and so we're teaching them about their government, about being involved. We've always encouraged them, explaining them about jury service and all the rest. And so the more we get them invested in their democracy, the more they'll understand their democracy and own it, and the better citizens we'll have, and we'll be the better for it. That's our challenge as my generation. We've got to get them to understand the value of their democracy.
Thank you so much, Justice Johnson. Dr. Tate, coming to you, same question. If the next 5 years is a chapter in the civil rights movement, what will it be about?
All right, got my mic on. I keep hearing for the younger generation, and that's so important to me. I think it's them, it's those that we got to put that charge on the younger generation to carry these memories with them, you know. And when I speak to a group when they come to the TEP Center, you know, that's my main focus. I let them know that the pathway is there. You just have to just take it and keep moving on. You know, it doesn't matter to me anymore who sits next to you, what color skin. Just make sure that they're on the right path and they're getting what they need to survive in this world. But it's going to take those young people to carry this on. They got to keep telling these stories. They need to start respecting and listening to the elders and that are still here to keep these stories moving, because nobody's going to put it in a book form. It needs to be in your head. You need to know this. I see a reaction with the younger generation when they come in and they visit the TEP Center and they watch some of that filming that we have. They really come out with a different feeling about what happened a long time ago, because they really do think that some of this happened during slavery, and it don't really matter. But they have to pick this torch up, and they just have to keep telling these stories to let people know where they could be these days. I don't know. It's on the young folks. It really is.
Thank you, Dr. Tate. I just want to recap some of the things that we were able to hear from our panelists. Judge Johnson reminds us that this next chapter is going to be about maintaining and understanding our history, as well as really understanding the power of voting. Chancellor Pierre told us about, really working towards making America a true multiracial democracy. Justice Johnson reminds us of the importance of getting young people to understand the value of their democracy. And Dr. Tate reminds us that the younger generation needs to take the lessons that are being provided right now, take them to heart, and use them to help fuel what our future advocacy can look like. When I think about this element of voting, and I'm reminded of one of the bills that came out of this legislative session, which makes it harder for folks to have voter registration drives. Essentially, if you want to have a voter registration drive, you have to first register your organization with the Secretary of State. And it was done, this bill was passed underneath the concern of some type of voter fraud, which there really haven't been documented cases of Louisiana having a problem of voter integrity. But I name that as a reminder that there are tactics being deployed in the name of improving our democracy, when really the problem has not been people registering to vote in a fraudulent way. So we should be critical of these quote unquote solutions that are in search of a problem when those problems haven't actually existed. One of the questions that we have in the chat, and if you have other questions, please put them in the chat box and I'll get to them. One question we have is that since our young people don't know much of if anything about the civil rights movement and what went on, with the attitude of our elected officials and what we teach in our schools, how do we educate young people so they understand where we are now? And this question is for any of the panelists. Do you have ideas of how we should be educating our young people to understand where we are now? And I'll add, like, where we are now in this civil rights era.
Well, I'll take this on. One place, it's got to be in churches. You know, we cannot rely on the public education system to provide that kind of background, information, and education. So we have to rely on churches to do so. And the significance of that, at least to a large part in terms of where I grew up in rural Louisiana, is that even prior to Brown in 1954, African Americans in rural areas didn't even have access to public education in many rural areas. The education they got in churches. That's where they got that education. If they were lucky, they might have had a high school in their parish, but if you look at where high school was available, it was available in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, some of the larger areas, Shreveport, but a lot of rural areas, there really was no access to a high school education. And there were people who actually commuted or went to and moved to New Orleans or Baton Rouge or some of these other places to even have access to a high school diploma. We were very fortunate in Louisiana in that, at least for a while, we had two very important individuals that helped create the ecosystem for Black primary education. And that would be Mother Catherine Drexel, St. Catherine Drexel, who did it through Catholic schools, and also the number of orders that helped create Catholic school education for African Americans, whether it be a boarding school at Holy Rosary Institute or St. Augustine in New Orleans and all these other schools across the state, of course. And then, of course, we have to look at the projects that happened with the leader of Sears Roebuck and his collaboration with Booker T. Washington in creating the one-room schools, the Rosenwald schools, that historically still exist or they're trying to preserve in those rural areas. And of course, the relationship of the Black Baptist Church, the AME Church, and the CME churches, and all of those churches that provided educational opportunity. So we now have to go back to those institutions and say, you have to talk about Black history. You have to do that. We spent a lot of time in Sunday school. We spent a lot of time in midweek vacation Bible academies and all that good stuff. And we have to take those opportunities to make sure that history is taught in a meaningful way to those individuals who are going to be part of those type of activities in the state of Louisiana and across America.
Thanks for that, Chancellor Pierre. In June of this year, I had the privilege of going to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And I got to sit in the church and listen to a recording of Dr. King's sermon called Loving Your Enemies. And in that sermon, he has a line that says, democracy is the greatest form of government, to my mind, that man has ever conceived. But the weakness is that we have never touched it. Right. And so Dr. King is talking about the design of democracy being something that is aspirational and is designed in a way that can benefit all Americans, but we have not actually experienced a true democracy just yet. And I think about if churches were educating its attendees in a way that I feel churches historically have done, I think we would have more butts and seats. But I'm also mindful of younger people not necessarily seeing churches as the institution to give them that type of education beyond just spiritual fulfillment, right? I believe at one point in time in our country, churches provided that spiritual fulfillment, but they also provided, intellectual curiosity and guidance of how to navigate the United States of America. And I don't know if that is still consistent today. Recognizing the value that churches can play, are there other ways in which we should be trying to reach young people where they are if they aren't necessarily in our churches on Sunday morning? Judge Calvin Johnson.
Well, we have to go to where they are, and of course the place they really congregate, where they really congregate, we can't get to, and that's school, and that's just real unless we change the reality of schools, especially those in New Orleans, and we can't get there. But the other place in terms of where they are is the internet. That is being able to get to them and talk to them through those things that they look at, they play with, they interact with, those places that all of those kinds of things that they can talk to each other on and do it instantly while we're having this conversation. Then we need to populate those places, like the TikTok thing, for instance. But those places with this information, but this way of convincing that 17 and a half year old in Louisiana that you can register to vote at 17 and a half. Yes, you can. And so that 18, of course, the same thing, and then 19, the same thing. But to use that kind of media to talk to them, recognizing, in all honesty, that it's very difficult to talk to them anyplace else. It's very difficult to do. Although, of course, all of those other ways we should engage in all the other ways that you can communicate with others. But the fact is to communicate with them, we have to take the communication to where they actually are. And that's that kind of that electronic, that medium that I barely know the names of, that kind of stuff. But that's the thing that we need to get our minds around in terms of our ability to do and to manipulate and to teach them using those kinds of methods that they use to teach themselves.
Thank you for that. Reverend Manning.
Thank you, Will. Just a quick question. Dr. Tate, you had alluded to and expressed that at McDonough 35, that Mr. McDonough has some racist tendencies and actions that he was engaged in, and history. I'm wondering if there are certain fights, for instance, that the change of the name of the school, that in your estimation would not be worth fighting at this point in time, in such a way that maybe the Willow School became the Willow School, and fought that fight in order to do so. Is a name change something that should be sought after because of racist tactics or foundations of the school?
The only problem I had with changing the names is the elders. Who are we going to say where we went to school? And I was more focused on the mascots because Nichols was my high school, and of course they honored the Confederate flag, and the mascot was Rebels. So it wasn't so much changing the name we wanted; we just wanted to change that mascot, which that happened, But now it's Frederick Douglass. But like myself, I graduated from Nichols. I can't say I graduated from Frederick Douglass, but I don't know. I was just a little confused on, did it really matter to change the name? Because then we don't have that longevity of family members coming out of the same school. Even with the way the charter system is today, we don't have it anyway. But I was a little baffled about that. I didn't know whether that was a good move or not.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. And Will, just one more question, and this is for I believe Chancellor said this, Chancellor Pierre, that churches need to do the job, and certainly with the decentralization and of our churches in our communities. I'm wondering, as a pastor, I take that on, and I take that as a very serious challenge, and to do so, and a responsibility is, as always, if the schools aren't doing it, we as churches and pastors need to take it on. Is there a curriculum that any of you know about that can be offered to pastors, or do we come up with our own set of curriculum which can be done, or do y'all endorse or think that there should be a group of folks such as yourself to come up with a curriculum that can be hand packaged, given to pastors, and say, this is it, this is how this should look in a Sunday school hour or midweek hour, this is what you can do and what it would look like? What do y'all think about that, or is there something like that already exists?
Well, obviously in the state of Florida, they were really in opposition to the AP African American history curriculum that was being offered, and there was a going back and forth and so forth and so on. So obviously there's something out there, but there are, through a number of different foundations, access to a lot of different information. For example, in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, my God, it's so rich with information that can be accessed. The Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, so rich with information. The African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. They all, so they all have different aspects to them. Plus, when we look at the historical records of universities, for example, in New Orleans, you got Xavier University, you got Dillard University. If you just study the history of the development of those particular institutions, and of course, Southern University was originally created in New Orleans in 1880. So there's so much local access. The Amistad Center, Kathy Hambrick and the Amistad Center, the African American the River Road Museum. So we have lots of information. I agree that I've never thought about how do you develop a curriculum, because what I end up doing is I do my research, and I know this, but I think you're right. Perhaps it needs to be a concerted effort to think about piecing together that curriculum, but the resources are there, particularly in a city like New Orleans with the Homicide Research Center. It's there. Now the question is, how do you? Sometimes people feel intimidated by saying, "How do I get together and put this together?" Because I'm not an educator by training and so forth and so on. And I do understand the hesitancy, but here's what we have in Black churches. Black churches are full of educators. So if you get the committee together of all those educators, they could come up with something that works for those particular communities, because that's really where it all is. I mean, it's in the people. It's definitely in the people that's in those churches.
Absolutely. Thank you. Back to you, Will.
Thank you, Reverend Manning. And first, I'd love to connect with you, Reverend Manning, so I can come and give a Juror Project presentation. A lot of folks know I'm a big jury duty nerd, and so I'd love to come and share that information with your congregation. Second, I want to come to Justice Johnson for kind of the last word as we're coming up on time. And this actually brings back up a question that Reverend Manning brought up as it relates to name changing. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, in Alabama, in Selma, is named after a person who was a senior officer in the Confederate Army. He also held a leadership position in the Ku Klux Klan and is known for Bloody Sunday. And we've all seen the images of John Lewis and others crossing the bridge just to be met by the sheriff's deputies and them getting beaten, almost to death and pushed back across the bridge. One of the things that John Lewis wanted to make sure is that name never changed on that bridge. He thought it was very important for it to remain the Edmund Pettus Bridge, even knowing who Edmund Pettus was. And so my question for you, Justice Johnson, is just echoing what Pastor Manning had lifted up. What value, if any, do you think changing names of schools or of streets or taking down of Confederate monuments, what role should that play in the way in which our communities are pursuing the concept of equality amongst communities, but also underneath the name of civil rights?
Well, I appreciate that question because I've crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. When we talk about, I agree with Chancellor Pierre. I think it's the churches and families who educate our children. My philosophy always was this: it was my job to teach my children about civil rights, and so I made sure my children understood the history of civil rights. I made sure that they got to the Civil Rights Museum. I made sure they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I agree with John Lewis. I think that there should always be an Edmund Pettus Bridge because it's kind of like there should. Are we going to change the name? We should always know who Hitler was, right? Because if we erase his name, then we will not know about all the horrible things he did. If we take the name Edmund Pettus off that bridge, we will erase the story about Bloody Sunday. We will erase the images of from that day where John Lewis and others crossed that bridge and they beat him in his head and caused a concussion and I don't want them to change the name of that bridge. I want those images to remain, just as just like some folks want to erase the images of January 6th. I don't want anybody to erase the images of January 6th. I want folks to remember the assault on our United States Capitol. I want them to remember those folk who assaulted the Capitol and tried to bring down our government. I don't want them to forget that. There's some things we shouldn't forget. We shouldn't forget Hitler. We shouldn't forget Edmund Pettus Bridge. We shouldn't forget January 6th. It should be ingrained in our memory. And so, even though the name is infamous, it's infamous in history.
Thank you so much for that, Justice Johnson. If folks can join me in a virtual round of applause for Chancellor Pierre, Judge Calvin Johnson, Dr. Tate, and Justice Johnson for joining us this evening. It has been a true pleasure to have this conversation with you all. And as much as we reflect on what the Civil Rights Act has been able to do and what it hasn't quite been able to do, I don't want us to forget what all of our panelists shared with us as it relates to that next chapter of our civil rights movement. Voting being important, history being important, engaging young people being important. And as we are nearing an important presidential election in November, if you're having conversations with folks who might have hesitancy on voting, one of the things that I like to remind people of is that it is very likely whoever the next president is going to be is going to appoint somebody to the Supreme Court. And that person on the Supreme Court will play a role in, reviewing constitutionality of legislation, of acts, of cases, whatever it might be. And that's going to be for a long time, right? Justices on the Supreme Court last 20, 25, 30 years, whatever it might be. So let's encourage everybody to vote because that's what our democracy is about. We collectively have more power than we think we do. There's this idea that you get 1,000 spiders together and they can tame a lion, right? So let's never lose sight of the power that we have together. That's at the heart of what democracy is all about. This has been a great conversation that Justice and Beyond has orchestrated, and I'm just very thankful for the invitation to help facilitate this conversation, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you, Will. We're just going to finish up some last couple of things. I want to echo your applause for our elders who have attended this panel tonight and been our guest panelists. I'm so glad that this is recorded. I'm so glad that we can get it out to many more people that were here tonight. I just want to reproduce it with some illustrations behind it and some videos, and some music. This was historic to have these legends here with us tonight. Thank you. But also want to give thanks to Mr. Will Snowden. Stellar job, phenomenal. Are just a couple of words that I could use. Thank you so much for being our guest moderator tonight and doing such an incredible job with it, as usual, sir. So thank you for being here. We're going to just conclude with a couple of announcements. We always take this opportunity, if anyone has any announcements, particularly about upcoming events in which we need to get engaged in or being aware of so that we can show up for them. If there are any at this time that anybody wants to make us aware of, please do so. Any announcements?
Reverend Manning, this is Betty. Jacques Moriel had to leave, but he wanted me to tell you guys there is an exhibit at the main library downtown right now through August the 23rd called The Trails They Blazed. They will be having, and Ms. Tate is part of that discussion, as a matter of fact. And on August the 17th from 1 to 3, there will be a panel discussion that Ms. Tate will be on with Malik Rahim and I can't remember who else, but 2 other people on August the 17th. So he wanted me to remind you of that. And then Raymond Sweet had something that he wanted to announce too, if Raymond's still here.
Thank you so much. I'm just announcing that we have a new campaign around voter apathy amongst Black millennials, and we're asking that any organization that wants to add their organization's name and email and website to our website, add your website to our website so that folks can get plugged in with you. We'd be glad to accept them. We are not a new organization. We're not a new thing. We are simply a social media and engagement campaign to get folks involved, and hopefully once people get plugged in, we'll back away from it. And the whole premise is that if people get engaged, they understand that their vote goes further than a ballot box. Their vote kind of extends it. It enhances their vote and allows them to vote every day when they're involved civically. And so that's what we want to do with our campaign.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Raymond. Any other announcements?
Shawan?
Yes, I have one. Good evening to Chancellor Pierre and Ms. Tate and Judge Johnson's. I just briefly about voting, and Professor Snowden had talked about this. I'm coming from the position with the Lower Ninth Ward Voters Coalition, who typically helps to organize high school voter registration efforts in this during election cycles. On the 13th, and I'll send it out to your leadership with the hope that they can send it to everyone. We're having a virtual meeting where I have invited the registrar's office along with, I've reached out today to the Secretary of State because of the challenges we as third-party organizers are having in making sure that we are able to continue to conduct high school voter registration efforts in the city of New Orleans. I invite each of you, your leadership, and any other person you want to share that with to be a part of this call on the 13th to make sure that we can get answers about being able to fully engage and help to register young people across the city.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
All right, we appreciate that announcement. Any other announcements? All right, I do just have one. On August the 8th, the City of New Orleans City Council will have on its agenda what is being called a peace statement that is in regards to the Palestine, Gaza, Israel conflict. The Palestinian community has been advocating and asking for the adoption of a ceasefire resolution. However, the City Council is putting forward a peace statement, which is not the same, but they will be entertaining comments about this in the City Council chambers on August the 8th. Not sure what time that will be exactly on the agenda, but please show up for that. Have your voice able to be heard, either for or against. It is very important. So that's this August the 8th at 10 o'clock. All right. Any other announcements? All right, everybody, hearing none, we're going to conclude with a word of prayer, as is our custom at Justice and Beyond, and always part of our agenda. So let me leave you all with prayer. Oh God, we just thank you for how far we've come. But God, we come with a recognition and understanding that we have a long way to go, that we cannot stop being on the battlefield, and that we cannot rely upon government to do what we know as parents, as grandparents, as leaders, we ought to do ourselves, and help us to take just great privilege and account it as a joy to be able to educate our children. God, even when sometimes they put up the attitude that they don't want to hear it, God, we believe today that our children are inwardly ingesting what is being spoken to them, that they are absorbing it, that they want to hear it, that they're being moved and motivated by it. And so, God, I thank you for those on this call tonight. I thank you for the leaders and the legends and the elders that presented on tonight. I thank you for the work that they have done and the work you continue to have for them to do. God, keep us all fighting for justice, demanding equality and equity all the time, every day, in every way that we can. We ask this all in the name of Almighty God and my Savior, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you all. Have a good night. We'll see you back next Monday at 5 o'clock.
Good night, everybody. God
Good night.
bless.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night, y'all. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Take care.